Hey folks, it's Brian Kane here with Millennial Cop and Listen. I have a special treat today. I kind of deviated a little bit from where we typically go with these kind of interviews. I'm actually doing kind of the sacrilegious thing here, and I am actually interviewing a lawyer. But that's okay because Lance LoRusso was actually a cop before he joined over to the lawyer side. So he knows exactly where we're coming from. He knows all the stuff that we deal with, and I'll let him tell you a little bit more about all that kind of stuff. Lance, I've introduced you to everybody. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, as I like to say, people say they hate lawyers, but they love their lawyer. So I'm very happy to be a lawyer for law enforcement officers. I have a lot of experience working with law enforcement. I was a law enforcement officer with Cobb County Police for a long time, and then I worked as an investigator with the solicitor's office. Prosecuted for a short period of time until I realized it was more fun chasing them over fences than it was prosecuting them in court. So opened up a civil practice focusing on law enforcement in 2008 after working with a couple of different law firms. The general counsel for the Georgia Fraternal Order of Police. And in addition to other civil cases, I don't do any criminal work unless it involves an officer-involved shooting. And I do actually respond out to the scene of officer-involved shootings.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I do want to hit on that a little bit later. I think it's important for everybody to know that the way that Lance and I met, Lance taught an 8-hour block of instruction at my Georgia Chiefs of Police chaplains conference that I went to get a chaplain certification. And when I looked at the schedule, I seen that there was an 8-hour block with a lawyer. All I could think was, "Oh dear goodness, this is going to be bad." But it wasn't. It didn't suck, which was kind of nice. And Lance was talking about putting out a book, which we'll get into just a little bit later. And so that kind of kicked off the whole friendship. Now, Lance, from coming from the law enforcement side and actually going over to the lawyer side, was that transition as easy for you as you thought it would be, or did you even think it was going to be easy?
It was tremendously easy. It was something that I had looked forward to. I will note that chaplain's class was interesting. That's the only time I've ever seen chaplains finding out there was a lawyer in the room and going out to their car and getting their guns and Kevlar before they came in. I'd looked forward to being a lawyer for a long time. I knew I didn't want to do criminal defense, and I knew when I started out, even when I was a low person on the totem pole with regard to the law firm I was working at, I knew I wanted to focus my practice on law enforcement. And it was an easy transition from the perspective of understanding the broader base that I wanted to get to. And the first couple of years practicing law are hard. When you start out knowing your profession and then you go into a new one, you walk around sometimes trying to light up a dark room with a flashlight until you realize there's a light switch on the wall.
That's one of those things that's always kind of intrigued me, how cops make that transition from a law enforcement career into something else. You always hear about these law enforcement officers who retire and then 3 years later, they're dead because they didn't do anything. Or you hear about these cops who get out and they're just miserable for the rest of their lives. Did you experience any of that in a career transition?
No, I didn't. I think one of the things that I always follow is if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. I loved being a cop. It was a tremendous amount of fun. I enjoyed the people I worked with. I enjoyed the work I was doing. And I had a great career. I got to try on a lot of different hats while I was working in law enforcement. But what's interesting is, as a lawyer, I get to see a lot of the other side of the issues we were dealing with. For example, when we were in the academy and when we were in civil liability classes, which is another class everybody looks forward to, kind of like an 8-hour lecture from a lawyer in chaplain school. All you hear is 1983 is this big bad Beowulf around the corner and it's going to eat you alive whether you made a mistake or not. Well, as a lawyer, I get to see the other side of that, and I see cases vigorously defended. I see people making arguments on both sides. And not surprisingly, most of the time, the cops that are doing the right thing, they win.
That that's That's important for officers to hear that, because there is a lot of times that we do something in our job and we automatically think, oh man, this is going to be a lawsuit and all that kind of stuff. Well, there's also happens to be this wonderful thing called summary judgment that that works out very well for law enforcement. So uh, now, what are some of the things that you see that cops get in trouble? Like, what would be one of the biggest things or the most common things that you see cops getting in trouble for?
Well, let's talk. When you talk trouble, let's talk disciplinary trouble before we talk civil liability. Because I'm afraid if I mention those two words, civil liability, and say that I'm going to give you some examples, some of your folks may actually go into comas, not necessarily just fall asleep. But, talking about discipline, there's a few areas right now that are real hot topics. One of them is social media. And probably about once a week, I send a Facebook message to a friend of mine saying, I know you had a bad day at work, but did you take stupid pills before you posted that on Facebook? And they'll write back and say, yeah, I probably should take that down. But social media really has a potential to get law enforcement in trouble from a couple of different perspectives. One is it's an easy, anonymous venting area. And people forget that it's not anonymous and it's forever. The second way a law enforcement officers get in trouble is they post things and they forget that whether you have protection on there or not, there's some things that just don't belong on the internet. I've routinely had to, if you will, sweep some law enforcement officers that I help look out after, and I'll find dates of birth on there, kids' dates of birth, kids' names, things like that, or just an utter lack of security measures on the site. Some of them, the message is getting around. I've had people that I've lectured to send me a friend request, and they're so locked down on security, I can barely see who they are to know whether I should accept their friend request. But, if you're going to get on social media sites, if you're going to have a Twitter handle, if you're going to be communicating with people over LinkedIn, you should make sure that everything on there is in compliance with your departmental policy. And that's for a couple of reasons. There are some people out there who may not be looking at your Twitter page or your Facebook page with the same sense of humor you are. And then unfortunately, there's some folks out there just looking to get you in trouble. Most departments are behind the curve on catching up with policies. But 9 times out of 10, when you look at those policies, it's really hard for me to argue. I believe you have a First Amendment right to communicate on social media, but if your department has a policy and it's reasonable, it's going to be really hard to defend any discipline.
I unfortunately I break a lot of those rules all the time. Uh, so like I have the presence on Facebook, I have the presence on Twitter, I have the presence on LinkedIn. I have the presence on a couple cop Facebook type websites, and I do a reasonable job protecting my stuff. But I also subscribe to the fact that my chief follows me on majority of those, so I know that hey, I better not be doing anything stupid. And luckily where I work, we have a very liberal social media policy because we've only had one person really say something that was just totally dumb and stupid and get in trouble, and that's what kind of brought up the whole social media thing. So it's it's nice not having to worry about that kind of stuff so much from a disciplinary aspect, but most people don't know that the Library of Congress is actually archiving every single tweet that hits Twitter. So if you think this is going away, it's not going away. It's archived, and man, people are going to have access to that kind of stuff. So in your moment of frustration, and I happen to know, I think one of the cops you might be talking about that you happen to send a message to. We won't name any names on this, but uh, these things are forever, and you see all the time cops posting stupid stuff, and it's like, God, man, why would they do that? Well, they. I think social media gives voice to some people who probably shouldn't have a voice sometimes.
Well, I think one of the things I've learned on this phone call is that somebody at the Library of Congress needs a hobby. But, wow. I think if you, a real good friend of mine who is Christina Coral, she's one of the associate general counsels for the national FOP, has put together a great program about Facebook. And some of the things that they are finding people doing on Facebook and then expecting not to get disciplined for, I'll use one of her examples that's great. If you're going to appear semi-nude on Facebook, you probably shouldn't wear part of your uniform. I think that's something we can all
Ah,
agree with. Some of the people I worked with, I just would agree that they should probably never appear semi-nude anywhere.
ever.
Yes, ever. But I think when you take those outliers out, I think it's important to recognize, and all kidding aside about Facebook, if you go on my Facebook page, you will see law enforcement officers that I have not worked with in 20 years. And you'll see people from my high school and you'll see people from college. And I am a firm believer that when you strap on a badge, you do not forfeit your rights. You don't forfeit your Fifth Amendment rights, your Sixth Amendment rights, and you certainly don't forfeit your First Amendment rights. And I have gone to battle with chiefs and sheriffs who have said that officers shouldn't be on Facebook at all. And I just fundamentally disagree with that. If your Facebook page consists of you being the proud dad and showing pictures of your daughter at the prom, then by God, you have a right to do that.
Absolutely. And we talked about, some of the things that you see people doing wrong, but we both know that an ounce of prevention is worth more than all of the bad stuff that you see every single day. So what are some things that officers can do to protect themselves from something like this to happening to them?
Yeah, and I actually posted a blog early on in Blue Line Lawyer. If you go in the archives, you'll see a blog on Facebook, and I've posted a couple of others. First and foremost is you need to put the security measures in place that you're comfortable with. There, you can dial down the access to your Facebook page in a tremendous way, and you need to take advantage of that. Second thing is you need to find out if your department has a policy. And also, to be quite honest, if you're looking at another department or you're thinking you may want to transition one day to another agency, you need to look at their policy and make sure you're not going to be violating their policy when a recruiter is checking out your application. Another thing is make sure that you're not posting anything that in any way could be seen as threatening or breaching the privacy of information that you received in the department or through official channels. And I think that if you go by the standard that Ken Blanchard used to use in his 1 Minute Manager books, it was kind of neat. He said, don't ever do anything you wouldn't want to read about in the paper the next day. I think it's a
Mm.
pretty good example because when people fire something off, if you sat and took a second to take a deep breath and said, would I want to see that on the front page of the local newspaper? You probably would type backspace a bunch of times and find something else to write.
Yep, absolutely. I don't have that filter. I internally do not possess that filter. So my wife does that for me. So
Oh, neat.
in my moments of frustration, I'll actually turn it to her and say, "Tell me if I should post that." And of course, most of the time the answer is no. But every once in a while, I think she likes to try and set me up for the divorce proceedings. And she says, "Oh yeah, sure, post that. That'll be fine."
Yeah. And in addition to Facebook, you were talking about some other hot areas for discipline. I think another area that people need to realize is there is really a growing lack of privacy in society today, and not just in law enforcement. You have cars being tracked by GPS. Your cell phone or PDA is just tracked very, very easily on GPS. I'm in a case right now where we were looking at some pictures that were taken. It's a civil case. And if you look at the information behind the picture that's taken just on an iPhone, I'm talking to you right now on an iPhone, and the pictures that are taken actually give the GPS coordinates of where the picture was taken, not just the day it was taken. It is just tremendous the amount of information that's out there. I've gotten involved defending officers who have taken pictures that were really innocuous. I mean, they weren't in the best of taste, and they were probably 3 steps shy of totally stupid. But when you go back and look, you posted that picture on Facebook, or someone got a hold of it and was posting it around the precinct. And it's very easy for someone to go back and figure out, well, you weren't supposed to be in the place that you were at the time you took the picture. And by the way, you were also supposed to be on duty. So I think realizing that you're under the microscope, and I think if we look in Boston, it's an interesting point. I just spoke to about 150 professional private investigators last weekend. And one of the things that I pointed out for them was the Boston bombers were picked up on private security cameras. So I think from a law enforcement perspective, it used to be, remember that you're on video when you turn the blue lights on. You have to remember you're on video all the time. If you're in uniform,
Right.
somebody's probably taking a video of you.
Well, even in our cars, my car records 1 minute back. So as soon as my emergency equipment activates or I activate the camera, whatever happened 1 minute back, buddy, that's memorialized forever.
And I'll tell you, more often than not, that helps law enforcement officers. I defended an officer who was involved in a shooting. He was attacked by a suspect on a traffic stop and wound up using deadly force. The suspect was not armed until he tried to take the officer's weapon. But his video camera, and he didn't even realize it at the time, his video camera had recorded and started recording a minute back from where the blue lights were actually turned on, and it wound up verifying the officer's story of how the interaction with the suspect started. So it does help. And the guidelines on turning off your audio or turning off your video are pretty serious, and I've seen some people disciplined just for that, just for turning off their video, and not realizing that when it's time to understand what's on there and the ramifications of it, you need to come clean if you've done something stupid. I know that one of the issues that I have a pet peeve with is officers being asked in investigations what happened on a video without showing them the video. The famous book, The Camera Never Blinks. I could go back a week from now and ask you what happened in a portion of this podcast, and I'm sure my recollection would not be as accurate as if I took a second to watch the podcast. So that's one
Right.
of the little due process things that I get hung up on, is when officers are, if you will, cross-examined in an internal affairs investigation or called on the carpet without having an opportunity to review the video prior. And sometimes what happens is that leads to inconsistent statements. And we all know what inconsistent statements means when somebody's trying to make out a disciplinary action that shouldn't be there. It just means you're lying. And that's one of my pet peeves.
Now, okay, so I do something stupid and I'm called onto the carpet, and this is going to be something that costs me my job. And I know that immediately. I immediately recognize, hey, look, they could probably fire me over this. What is your suggestions for what do I do next?
Well, I think one of the first things you need to do is talk to an attorney and figure out if you're reading the policy the same way that the attorney does. I think the second thing you need to realize is that you have an obligation to cooperate fully with administrative investigations. One of the things that people forget, Garrity is a protection. The Garrity warning is a protection for any criminal investigations that cross over into administrative investigations. So any statements that you make under Garrity are, if you will, immunized. Nobody can prosecute you for anything that you admit to during an administrative investigation. The exception to that is any false statements. So I think sometimes people fail to get their head together before an investigation. I tell people all the time, if you're going to go in there, if you know that there's an investigation going on about people taking too long on meal breaks, I'll just pick something innocuous. Before you go into that investigation, you should probably read the policy on meal breaks. And people take those things for granted without being prepared for the interview. And that's one of the things that I think is critical. You can't go in there defenseless. And then if you don't know the policy, what's going to be your answer? Well, I read it the first time they gave it to me, and I closed the book and never opened it again. That's not acceptable under any set of circumstances.
Right, absolutely. Well, let's jump into kind of the or your meat and potatoes on this kind of stuff. Let's talk about some officer involved shooting stuff.
Okay.
Uh, you know, I don't really want to kind of pick apart the whole shooting aspect of it, but once it's done, once everything is done, the scene is calmed down and everybody's there that is asking you all the questions and stuff. Walk us through the process of what we should be doing to prepare us for the aftermath.
Okay. And that preparation starts now. The preparation should start when they're in the police academy. And I think what people don't prepare for and what people don't realize is shootings don't happen where you're firing rounds on a range. Shootings happen in incredibly fluid circumstances. Graham versus Connor was a U.S. Supreme Court case that talked about law enforcement officers being involved in ever-changing, rapidly evolving circumstances. And I think that's probably the best statement and summary of what you can put in context when you're preparing for an officer-involved shooting. Morally, spiritually, physically, you have to prepare for that event to make sure you wind up on top. I can tell you in most situations, and this is not just my personal anecdotal evidence, this is looking at the statistics of law enforcement around the United States. Typically, shootings are what we would call a good shoot. They're an appropriate use of force. And the reason is we train the daylights out of law enforcement in the United States. We have shoot, don't shoot scenarios. We have simulators. We have extensive in-service training in the vast number of departments. So the first thing I think you need to realize is if you perceived a threat with all the training you've been through, you probably made a good decision. Now, the second thing you need to realize is that if your body is completely overwhelmed by the situation, I actually was recently involved in a shooting where an officer took a round to the vest and didn't even realize it during the firefight. If you are completely overwhelmed by the situation, that is the last time you need to be making a in-depth statement about what just occurred. Now, the bad guy went this way, I was standing here, there should be some evidence here. That's different than sitting down and making detailed statements about what occurred. Your perceptions are off. And one of the common things, I spoke to an officer about 2 weeks ago, about an hour after a shooting. And not just a shooting, about a week ago, I spoke to another officer about a critical incident. And I said, "Are you tired?" And in both situations, they were dead quiet. And they said, "How did you know that?" Well, when your adrenaline runs at full speed for 5 or 10 minutes, you're going to be tired and your body is going to make you crash and your body is going to put you down on the ground, whether you want to be or not. So you've got to get those sleep cycles in place before your brain will start processing all that you've been through. So probably the first thing you need to recognize is everybody reacts differently, but even people who have been in hot situations before, you need to recognize that it's okay if your brain is scrambled. It's okay if your body's exhausted, because that's a natural reaction to the stressful event you just went through.
So, at what point would be the time where people should be looking to secure themselves some type of legal representation after an officer involved shooting?
I personally think at the scene, and I have spoken to a lot of people who represent law enforcement. I've lectured a couple of times to the National General Counsel's Conference for the National FOP. And one of the things that is an overwhelming theme is if you are not prepared to go out to the scene and actually look at what happened, then you probably don't need to be representing law enforcement officers in shootings. Shooting scenes typically happen in environments that cannot be set up again. And I'll give you an example. Those are the people listening to this who are accident reconstructionists. And to give you an idea how long ago I did any of that work, we were pulling tapes. So
Nice.
a long time ago. But the theory of an accident reconstruction is I can go out there with a set of tapes or a total station or some sort of mapping device, and I can find my anchor and take those cars and put them back and reconstruct everything. Well, you can't do that with a shooting situation. Officers' feet and shoes do not leave skid marks when they hit the ground. An officer kneeling down next to their car is not going to leave an imprint of exactly where they were on that car. Bad guys shooting from one position and leaving some brass, and then moving and shooting from another position, leaving some brass, are not going to leave a mark unless somebody has completely mapped the brass. And all we can do from that brass location, we've all seen the little tents on TV, all you can do from there is estimate where the bad guy was standing or where the officer was standing. If I find a magazine laying next to some brass, I can pretty much conclude that the officer was standing in a reasonable proximity to that. But I've shot a lot of pistol matches where people are running at the same time that they're changing magazines, so magazines can move. So the bottom line is going out to the scene and having a chance to look at that lawyer and say, this is where I was standing, this is what I perceived, and letting that second set of eyes that has had sleep and is not running through the tunnel vision focus that you're running through to look for bigger picture items that need to be examined before you make a statement is critical.
That's absolutely awesome. So now, obviously, we all hope that in the tragic event that we do have to do some type of officer involved shooting, that all the years from or all the years back from mandate school don't come rushing up and tell us that we're going to be sued. Uh, what is your how involved are you in the suit aspect of an officer involved shooting, the civil suit?
Well, that's an excellent question, and there's a lot of misconceptions on exactly what that means. That's one of the reasons, that was really, Brian, one of the biggest reasons why I wrote my book, When Cops Kill, because we tell people in the academy, I've been a firearms instructor for years, and we tell people, well, if you use deadly force, even if you're justified, you might get sued. Well, what does that mean? Well, the first thing you have to realize is that most lawsuits are just about money. There are some lawsuits when they're asking for injunctions, they're asking for better training, but most of the time they're about money. Somebody believes that they were wronged, injured, killed, family member was taken, and there was a violation of the law or violation of a tort duty, and they're seeking money damages. But lawsuits, essentially, you have to prepare for those lawsuits before you make your first statement to the investigators. And I mean the administrative investigation and the criminal investigation. Remember, we're talking parallel investigations in American law enforcement and when there's a use of force. And the criminal investigation is always voluntary. Always, always, always. It's a voluntary statement to the criminal investigators. But by the time the civil case comes up, there really is no difference between the administrative investigation and the criminal. The lawyers that are filing suit on behalf of the suspect who was shot will have access to both. And I'll give you an example how a perfectly innocent set of circumstances lead to a bad problem for the agency and a bad problem for the officer in a civil suit. Officer gets involved in a shooting, and let's say they're fairly young on the street. Their adrenaline kicks in very quickly. Their auditory exclusion kicks in very quickly. They've never been involved in a shooting before. Their tunnel vision is so deep, it's like they're looking through a straw when they fire the shots. When they get to the scene, let's say they're interviewed right away. They're not given a chance to have any downtime. They're not given the 48 hours, the 2 or 3 sets of sleep cycles that we recommend. You ask them, where were you standing? I really couldn't tell you. What did the suspect say? I don't know. How many shots did you fire? I couldn't tell you. What did the suspect do after you fired the first shot? Well, I can't even sort that out right now. And how many magazines did you use? I don't know. All I know is the suspect went down and my partner was calling 911, calling the radio. And the next thing I knew, citizens were coming up. I was ordering them to get back, and my sergeant came up and took my firearm and told me to get behind the car. Now, what's going to happen is when that deposition comes up in that lawsuit, 6 months, maybe sometimes a year or 18 months after that initial event, the officer will have started to remember some of those items, a lot of those details, within 48 hours. So we take the officer's statement and we say, how many shots did you fire? Well, now he knows. So he has to answer honestly. So 18 months, he says, I fired 7 shots. Well, did you drop your magazine? No, my magazine holds 15 rounds, so I fired 7 shots. There were still 9 left in the gun. Okay, and where were you standing? Well, now he's already looked at the crime scene pictures. Well, I was standing here and the suspect fell. Well, what did the suspect say when you told him to put his hands up? Well, he didn't know that night, but now he's looked at all the videos. Now all of his buddies have told him. Well, he said, you know, go ahead and shoot me. Go ahead and shoot me. We saw that in a recent video that's on YouTube right now. Well, what happens is if you're playing that to a jury and you don't have an expert explain why the officer wouldn't be able to know those things, there's a presumption that if you didn't know something right away after an event, how could you possibly know it 18 months out? And there is a specter hanging over that testimony in the civil case that in the criminal case, the officer was lying. And that is completely unreasonable and completely unnecessary. But time and time again, I hear agencies say there's no reason for us to give law enforcement officers a time to get some sleep or anything before they give a statement because we don't give that courtesy to criminals. Well, criminals don't have families, and criminals didn't pray that morning that they didn't have to use deadly force before they went to work.
Exactly. That's some awesome advice, and man, that just being able to hear that from a professional, from someone who does it all the time, knowing what steps that we need to take after some type of incident like that is actually it's very common to me to know that there's people out there that are actually looking out for us during all this kind of stuff. You know, one of the things that I did want to make sure that we got in, I know we're coming up close on time here, is I wanted to get in something about your book, When Cops Kill. Tell us a little bit about that book and what kind of brought that on.
Thank you. Well, the book is called When Cops Kill, The Aftermath of a Critical Incident. And the book is based on a lot of different things. It's based on, if you will, a cop turned lawyer's view of the world of law enforcement and use of force. I'm fascinated by how our courts deal with it. I also interviewed a bunch of people who were involved in deadly force situations. I've interviewed some people in the military who were involved in situations. I've interviewed people who were shot, and interviewed some folks where not all the good guys came home, and use these as a backdrop to talk about everything from administrative investigations to criminal investigations to civil suits, how your body reacts to stress, how officers deal with shootings 10 and 15 and 20 years later. Officers that I interviewed who are involved in shootings almost 20 years prior, literally tearing up and their breathing increasing when they're talking about a situation that happened, and they're in the safety of their office or my office, absolutely no threat to them at all. So the book really talks, and it's really for officers and their families, it talks about the realities of the use of force in a society where we second guess every officer's use of force. And in our criminal justice system, when you shoot someone, the presumption is that the shooting was a violation of the law. The fact that you are using deadly force appropriately is what's called a justification under the law. It's an affirmative defense, and it's up to the officer to create that affirmative defense and establish it. The key that we hear, the person was shooting at me, I shot back, I used deadly force. The suspect who's committing an armed robbery and the officer shoots them. The person holding a hostage and a officer with a high-powered rifle shoots the bad guy from across the street. That is not just automatically justified. The burden rests on the officer to explain the facts, to set the stage, if you will, to provide the justification that will be used in criminal courts and civil courts for years after that split-second decision. So it is worth it to slow the situation down, to give the officer time to decompress, and to make sure that the statements they give can be used to defend themselves and the agency. So When Cops Kill was an effort to get that message out, and all of the profits from the book will benefit law enforcement charities.
Now, I know that you also you have a lot to do with a nonprofit organization. Tell us a little bit about that too.
Yeah, Hunting for Heroes. I'm tremendously proud of that. Hunting for Heroes was founded by a couple of law enforcement officers up in Missouri, and they realized that we had all sorts of programs in place to help the families of officers who are fallen in the line of duty, but there really is no national organization that's looking after officers who are disabled in the line of duty. And Hunting for Heroes, org, does just that. We do peer counseling for officers. We do retreats with their families and their children. And we really let them know how able-bodied they can be. These officers go through a tremendous amount. We've had officers involved that we've served, and we do it nationally, who have been fired over the phone. People who were brought to retirement ceremonies after a year when they couldn't come back. They were told there was going to be a retirement ceremony, and they showed up, and they were retired from the department with 2 canines. So absent extraordinary circumstances, there is no lifetime health benefit. There's no great disability insurance and disability program for these officers. They're left to fend for themselves. So Hunting for Heroes looks out after them and their families, and we bring them back in the fold and let them know that there are people who care about them, and let them know that there is a life after the injury that they suffered. I just wrote an article on officers that you'll see in Law Enforcement Today during Police Week, talking about the tough part for these disabled officers, and I'll give you 2 examples. We all think about the last call we're going to have on the street right before our retirement party, and you have to remember that the call that these officers were disabled during is the last time they will ever ride in the police car. It's the last time they'll ever answer a call for service. And we had an officer who had a traumatic brain injury at one of our retreats. We asked his 12-year-old son, what's the best part about this weekend? And he didn't talk about shooting the BB guns or shooting the rifles or hunting or fishing. He said, nobody's asking me what's wrong with my dad. And, that just exemplifies how much this officer's injury and the sacrifice they made for their community just has forever changed that family unit.
That's absolutely that's heart-wrenching, man. It really is. To hear about somebody that has sacrificed so much for the public, and then they're just forgotten about.
Well, people ask us all the time, how many officers are there out there like this? You can go on the FBI's page, FBI law enforcement page, law enforcement officers killed and injured in the line of duty. You will not see any statistics, and we haven't been able to find any, that discuss how many law enforcement officers are disabled to a point where they have to leave the profession. Right now, we have about 100 people on our waiting list to bring to hunts. And essentially what we do is we bring them into a hunting camp environment, 5 family units at a time. They pay for absolutely nothing. We pick them up at their house. We get them to the airport. Some of them can't fly, so they have to drive. We pay their mileage, put them up in the hotels. And the number one overwhelming statement we hear from them is, you made me feel like a cop again.
Man, that's so important to someone who hasn't felt that way in years after feeling that way for 20 years,
Hey, it's part of our identity. If you've been in law enforcement for 10 minutes or 10 years and 40 years, being a cop is part of your identity. And when that's stripped away involuntarily without any warning, it's tough. It's really hard. So we bring them back in the fold.
That's quite an honorable thing, man. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Why don't you tell us how we can get in touch with you, and tell us how we can get a hold of that book.
Great. So far as getting in touch with me, you can go to my website, which is LoRussoLawFirm.com. It's LORUSSO lawfirm.com. My blog is BlueLineLawyer.com. And there's a couple of places you can buy the book. You can buy the book at BookLogix. You can buy it at Amazon. But the easiest way is to go to WhenCopsKill.com. whencopskill.com, and you'll find a way to get everything from multiple copies to an ebook that we'll be coming out with probably in the next 30 days. And if you really want to deface a book, you can send me some money, and I'll even sign it for you. How about that?
Fantastic. And I just want to let everybody know listening out there that I've created a link to make that easier to remember. If you'll go, not like whencopskill.com couldn't be easy to remember, but if you'll go to millennialcop.com/whencopskill, that'll take you directly to the whencopskill.com page, and you can get all that kind of stuff and maybe even get Lance to do a little bit of scribbling on a book for you.
And remember, all the profits go to law enforcement charities, and that's just the way it should be.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, Lance, thank you so much for taking the time out to do this kind of stuff. And man, you've been awesome, and you're one of the few lawyers that I actually look forward to talking to. So thank you for taking the time to do this, and you rock, man. Thank you so much.
Brian, I'm honored to represent law enforcement, and thank you so much for the opportunity.